Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Uh, Thank you for joining our webinar. This is the last webinar for the series, and it's on decommissioning of oil and gas fields. The webinar is brought to you from UNEP, who works in partnership with the government of Norway's Oil for Development program. So, in this webinar, we'll be seeing the webinar will be discussing mainly the key principles and steps in sustainable decommissioning. It will look at environmental, regulatory, and legal frameworks, as well as challenges and opportunities related to offshore and onshore decommissioning. So while the long-term goal of UNEP is to reduce the world's reliance on fossil fuels to fight climate change, it is also recognized that oil and gas will continue to remain part of the global energy mix for the foreseeable future. This is why UNEP's work is to ensure that oil and gas producers are being managed in an environmentally and social acceptable manner and do not impact negatively on the local communities. So um, part of the objectives of this partnership with the OFD is to strengthen institutional capacity of governments in OFD countries to improve environmental management in the oil and gas sector, specifically related to water, soil, and air emissions. Also to reduce environmental risk, including oil spills associated with development of hydrocarbon resources, and to establish models for sustaining long-term capacity building efforts, and also to increase accessibility and dissemination of trainings on environmental management in the oil and gas sector. So we do this through the services we provide, and our main services are institutional capacity needs assessments for strengthening environmental management in the oil and gas sector. We also provide national and regional level trainings for knowledge and skills transfer, direct technical assistance at policy and field level, and finally, global outreach for wider dissemination of knowledge and trainings, which this webinar falls under. So over the years, we have built a virtual online community of practice to improve access to industry best practices. So you can find us on LinkedIn under the name of Global Network on Environment and Oil and Gas. So we have over 2,900 members, and feel free to join our network on LinkedIn. We also provide monthly newsletters that show upcoming events, new publications, and online trainings and resources and more. So just for you to note, this webinar is being recorded. So you can use the chat to write any questions that you might have in the for the Q&A session, which will be at the end of all presentations. And then we'll also send you a link at the end of the webinar. It's a survey link, so we get your feedback because we would like to know how to improve our future webinars. So completion of this survey is a prerequisite to receiving your certificate of participation, and it will be provided to you within 1 week of completing the survey. So as you are attendees, you'll be subscribed to our mailing list to receive our monthly newsletter. So please feel free to unsubscribe if you do not want to receive this anymore. So with that being said, I would like to introduce our moderator. She is an environmental scientist who is passionate about people and sustainability. She has over 18 years experience in the field of environmental management and auditing, using her education skills and experience to create an impact in Kenya. She is currently the chair and president of the Environment Institute of Kenya and works as a private consultant. And she's called Linda Munyao. Hello, Linda. Welcome to the webinar, and over to you.
Hi, Chi. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to our webinar today. We're really glad to have so many participants from different countries across the world, so thank you very much. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today, and I'd like to request you to switch on your cameras. We'll start with Ping Tail. If you could come, Ping. Great. Hi, Ping.
Hello, Linda.
So Ping is decommissioning manager, and she works at the International Association for Oil and Gas Producers. Thank you, Ping. Hi, Matt, I can see you. Next, we have Dr. Matthew Richmond, and he's a senior consultant for the UNEP. And then last but not least, Sven. Good, welcome very much, Sven. So Sven Arns Svilåsen is an economist, and he works at the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate. So these are the great panelists that we have today, and we are really excited to hear what you have to say. So we can now proceed, and I'd like to invite Ping, who's our first presenter for today, and Ping is going to set the scene for us. So Ping, if you could get ready. So just a bit more about Ping. Ping is a decommissioning manager, as I've told you, at IOGP, and in her current role, she manages and drives the activities at the decommissioning committee. So she actively leads in sharing of international experience and good practice. So she's originally from Brunei, and she's a project engineering manager, 15 years experience. So we really look forward to this Ping. And she's had leading roles in offshore, greenfield, brownfield, and decommissioning projects in Brunei and New Zealand. So welcome, Ping. We could proceed now with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Let me move my slide. So, yes, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My presentation today is in 3 parts. I will start by first giving an overview of the global decommissioning science, describing the processes involved, highlighting some of the key decisions required in decommissioning and the regulation and guidelines currently available. From there, I'll move on to discuss the challenges and opportunities associated with decommissioning, and then wrap up by discussing how the industry and key role players are responding to these challenges and opportunities. Let's start by building an appreciation of the global decommissioning science. As fields reach the end of their economical field lives, wells and their associated facilities must be responsibly decommissioned. This has been occurring in the past few decades, especially in the mature producing regions, offshore initially led by the Gulf of Mexico with an average of 100 platforms a year since 1985, followed by the North Seas. Activities are picking up rapidly in Asia Pacific, including in my native country, Brunei, which is looking at removal of up to 50 platforms in the next decade. Let's quote a few numbers predicted by analysts. We are expecting some $104.5 billion decommissioning spend by 2030, 42 billion USD spend by 2024. And in terms of asset numbers this decade, some more than 50 structures and more than 2,500 wells in the North Seas, more than 1,500 small structures and more than 7,000 wells in Southeast Asia. Let's now move on quickly to what's involved in a typical decommissioning process. You see here some illustrations of an offshore platform and an onshore wellhead. As a general rule of thumb, a project team should be formed 5 years prior to execution, possibly more for the more complex offshore projects. Firstly, we need to make a decision on cessation of production, COP in short. This is commonly an economical decision influenced by higher maintenance costs of the aging assets, lower oil prices, and reduced hydrocarbon in the fields, making it not technically possible to continue extraction or not cost effective to do so. It may also be due to an expiry of license to operate. So as wells cease production, they must be permanently plugged downhole. The system and connected pipelines are depressurized, flushed free of hydrocarbon, and disconnected. And then asset removal preparatory work can also occur during this time. Now, once freed of hydrocarbon and the wells plugged, the assets are in what we call cold suspension mode. Cutting and removals would follow, and then site remediation and monitoring to a level safe for other users of the land or the sea. Now, throughout the process, a large volume of waste, including flash water, concrete, marine growths, piping and pipeline steel, etc., which can contain hazardous substances, need to be carefully managed. The clean structural steel, which is a valuable commodity, is typically recycled. Now, this slide summarizes some of the key decisions throughout the decommissioning process that need to be made by the asset owner. The decision on when cessation of production happens, the level of maintenance and inspection needed prior to removal, that is not zero. What is the early removal scope prior to the major lifts? And perhaps of most interest to many, what is the end state? How will the site look like post decommissioning? Do we remove all, remove partially, or leave partially in situ? How deep do we cut the piles and conductors? What decommissioning methodology to employ? What waste management strategy to follow? And what should be the post-decommissioning monitoring requirement? Where there are options, these decisions are typically made following a multi-decision criteria analysis process, which include consideration on safety, environment, stakeholders' views, and so on. For more complex projects, there will be a need for data collection and years of detailed study as input to these decisions. The whole decommissioning process must be carefully must comply to a set of international and national decommissioning regulation to ensure that it is done safely with no harm to people and the environment. There are various supporting guidelines that helps to inform. In the mature region where decommissioning has been executed, like Gulf of Mexico, the North Seas, regulations are mature, well understood, and tested. In some Asia-Pacific countries with increasing decommissioning activities, regulation has developed in the recent 5 years. In Australia, for example, we have new legislations related to decommissioning put in place just months ago. Yet in other countries where the industry exists but is younger, example Tanzania, Mozambique, we understand that there are still no decommissioning specific national regulations. IOGP have 2 free to download documents summarizing this regulation, one for facilities and another for wells on our website. We've spoken now about the global size of decommissioning, had an overview of the process and key decision required. Let's now look at and discuss the challenges and opportunities faced by the industry. And here on screen, we have a few examples of onshore assets that are typically fully removed during decommissioning and any contaminated soil remediated. Onshore decommissioning is arguably logistically simple than offshore, but the assets could be in jungles, could be in close proximity to communities. Pipelines could run close to towns, over rivers, near environmentally sensitive coastal ground. This presents potential impact to the community and the environment during and post decommissioning and must be carefully considered. Offshore, we have a different set of challenges. There is a wide range of asset types, which could be floating, subsea, or fixed to the seabed. The majority of offshore assets are offshore fixed structures, steel-piled jackets in shallow waters, less than 120 meters, and in some deeper waters, we have concrete gravity-based structures, what you can see on the screen here. Now, these massive offshore structures, some taller than the Eiffel Tower, need to be cut hundreds of meters below the waterline and then removed to shore. Offshore, exposed to the weather elements, this is quite a significant technical, logistical, and safety challenge. Once cut and lifted, structures need to be brought to a suitable onshore port and demolition yard. And often these structures were built overseas, and for countries new to decommissioning, like Brunei, a new local port and demolition yard often need to be developed. Waste management infrastructure need to be ready to process these waste, including steel recycling facilities, oily liquid processing plant, and engineered landfills. Another challenge faced by the industry and governments are that assets are being orphaned, which, if still containing hydrocarbon, poses a significant safety and environmental risk. There are legal tensions between various parties on who pays for this decommissioning of these assets where an owner had become bankrupted. Not the government, the taxpayers, then will it be the previous asset owners? shared amongst all the operators in the country, some of which may have nothing to do with these assets. There are no easy answers, but we know that early planning and early understanding of the decommission costs for all parties during the asset, especially during asset sales and transfer, will help avoid these scenarios. Yep, sorry, I scrolled too fast. There are some opportunities in decommissioning as well. Mature marine ecosystems have developed around much of the man-made infrastructure. There are significant evidence that demonstrate the value of ecosystem associated with this man-made structure and their role in the marine environment. Many countries, such as Brunei, Thailand, Malaysia, California, etc., supports the reefing of some of these structures for a variety of purposes. To support marine biodiversity, increase fish stock, protects against illegal bottom seabed trawling, or simply for tourism diving. Reefing isn't simply leaving the structures in situ or sinking the whole structure. Location need to be carefully considered for the reef to achieve its intended purpose. These decommissioned structures also have potential for reuse. Next Step and OGUK issued excellent annual reports on reuse opportunities in the Netherlands and the UK respectively. There has been assets that were reused for other hydrocarbon production. There are ongoing projects to repurpose assets for carbon storage projects, not just in the UK, Netherlands, but also other parts of Europe and Asia. Carbon capture and storage projects play a key role as a climate change mitigation technology alongside renewables. And here is, I guess, my key message. We can manage these challenges and realize these opportunities through early planning, and policies and regulations that are risk-based and allow consideration of developing decommissioning science and technology. New offshore structures to consider decommissioning in its design. They should consider decommissioning in its design. We need to maintain an overview of the decommissioning cost estimates, ensure that there are sufficient funds, prepare the supply chains needed to execute the work. There's potential for more efficient campaign this way. Develop decommissioning science and technology. There are an increasing number of organizations that are leading in the decommissioning, in the development of decommissioning guidelines, sciences, and technologies. I strongly that you visit the website of the organization that you can see logo with the logo on my slides here. And with that, I end the presentation and I hand it over to Linda.
Thank you very much, Ping. You've set the scene so well for us, and we can clearly see the challenges and the opportunities that lie there. So we really appreciate that. I hope everyone is noting their questions, then we'll have them at the end. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Matthew Richmond, to take us through the key principles and key steps undertaken during decommissioning. So Matt, you're welcome to put up your screen. And while he gets his screen ready, I'd just like to tell you a bit about Dr. Richmond. So he's a marine scientist with over 30 years of experience on diverse marine and environmental issues, mainly in East Africa, but also in Saudi Arabia and Europe. He has worked in academia, he has studied and taught marine biodiversity, he's worked on marine protected areas and sustainable marine resource use, and various environmental issues associated with the oil and gas sector. So he really has a good background and a good experience to be able to share a lot more about oil and gas decommissioning, key principles and steps. So thank you so much, Matt. Karibu sana. Welcome. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much, Linda. Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you can hear, you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see you and we can see your screen.
Great. So thank you, Ping, for giving us a very comprehensive overview, setting the scene with respect to what actually takes place in the decommissioning process. I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on some of the key principles and some of the steps, focusing more on the environment. So the key principles in sustainable decommissioning of oil and gas fields, and the key steps in the sustainable decommissioning that need to be considered, and briefly to give an overview on environmental impacts and the considerations related to the decommissioning, and the environmental and social impact assessments, which often precede the decommissioning in the project phase, and then maybe precede the decommissioning specifically prior to those activities. And then the incorporation of best practice. There are different forms of best practice which are being followed in different parts of the world. And then a few very brief examples of ESAs for decommissioning or for decommissioning facilities. So the steps in decommissioning, there's more or less 9-10 steps depending where you are and depending what's involved. But for onshore and offshore project management, planning and engineering, that's typical for all cases really, and that's focusing on contractual obligations, engineering analysis, operational planning, and those kind of steps. And then there's permitting and regulatory compliance. And that is a process that can take several years, depending where you are in the world, and depending on the laws which are applicable. As Ping mentioned, in some countries there aren't any laws yet regarding decommissioning because the oil and gas fields are still fairly new. For example, Tanzania, the one which is still being used now, was only really started to be exploited in 2006. So if we allow 20-30 years for standard hydrocarbon reservoirs to be consumed, then that's probably still got another 5, 10, 15 years to go. Similar case in Mozambique, but obviously it's not the case in the Gulf of Mexico and different parts of the States and Colombia and even the Southeast Asia. So then the areas here which I've highlighted, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, these are the actual kind of nuts and bolts of decommissioning, which Ping talked about. And some of these are obviously deep sea, mobilizing derricks and barges and platforms, removal of platforms, but pipelines and power cables are applicable to land as well. Then I'll talk a little bit more about the materials and disposal, because that's one thing which is common to all decommissioning. You end up with large quantities of diverse materials, and then the whole process of client site clearance right at the end. So a lot of information on this slide. This is from a Nigerian document on the sustainable closure and decommissioning of offshore and offshore oil and gas assets. 2015, there's a website that's downloadable, the report on that. I've modified it slightly to be able to make it more visible. What are the actual 9 principles that should be articulated as a minimum standard by the environmental social impact assessment departments and regulators who are looking at decommissioning in their countries. So it begins with number 1 on the left-hand corner at the bottom, increasing operator self-regulation. So ideally, the companies themselves should be adhering to the best practice and those kind of steps, which throughout the whole project life cycle, and from the beginning right through to closure and cleanup. Then the next one is number 2, top right, improving corporate social responsibility and social license to operate. This again is an emphasis on the operator to do what's best to support institutions and communities that in their operating area. Then kind of nitty-gritty really in the middle, number 3, reducing environmental and social impacts. And this is more or less the focus of my short presentation. And there are various ways to do that depending on the situation. Then stepping on from that, obviously the next one is you end up with these materials. Can you recycle them and can you reclaim the area? So reclamation and recycling materials, number 4. Then you've got to remove the materials. Number 5 on the bottom right, removal of hazardous waste and material. That's got to be removed away from the site as the beginning of the process, of which is then number 6, rehabilitation of the areas affected during the operation. There are various ways to do that depending on the situation. Contaminated site assessment is one process, and rehabilitation, removal of hydrocarbons, which is typically a pollutant that remains in some sites around the world. Then behind all that, there is a process called financial assurance. And this is something which many countries might be experiencing, especially those who are new to this sector really, who's going to pay for it at the end of decommissioning? Will it be the company who started it, or will it be the company that bought the company who started it, or will the company abandon their site and leave it to the government? So there's a whole issue there, and many guiding documents on financial assurance. Going on from that, again, an overall approach is at number 8, top left, iterative process of learning and development. So as things move along in the local countries, they improve the process and learn from their successes and from their failures. And then finally, in the bottom right, monitoring and enforcement. So that's critical in all parts of the world, that there has to be some sort of oversight to the process of decommissioning, because there are, as I'll demonstrate in the next slides, there are issues that can go wrong. There are accidents that can happen. There is contamination that can be worsened depending on how the procedures are followed. Potential environmental and social impacts. So this is related to principle number 3 from the previous slide. And some of the most common ones associated with the sector are discharges to sea, sewage, food waste, ballast water, treated bilge, gaseous emissions from vessels and equipment, underwater noise from vessel operations, dynamic system, cutting tools and methods that can be very noisy, physical disturbance to seabed, suspended sediment, local smothering, rock dump, waste, and naturally occurring radioactive materials, which often form inside pipelines that remain radioactive and need to be handled properly. And then there are various odors, noise, and disturbance from onshore waste facilities to local residents. And then something that's often not seen is the metals and trace amounts from sacrificial anodes, zinc, aluminium, which might enter the sediment. So these are some of the issues and some of the environmental social impacts you need to look at. The document from where the previous slide came from is the one I'm showing here, which is a white paper on sustainable and decommissioning of oil and gas assets in Nigeria. And you can just see from the picture here, there's a crude oil pipeline. This is in a mangrove delta area, and going right through communities where there are children paddling around in boats. It's very sensitive to oil spill. There's a lot of history of oil spill for all sorts of different reasons going on in the area. So decommissioning in those kind of situations can be complex, logistically, technologically, in terms of social and environmental impacts. So decommissioning in a mangrove area where a lot of people is very different from decommissioning on the high seas. They all have their challenges, and they need to be studied in a lot of detail beforehand. So again, related to principle number 3, the environmental social impact assessment. So the ESIAs for the exploration and development in many countries is mandatory before the exploration, and they more recently tend to include a section on decommissioning. However, from my experience, that section on decommissioning of the EIA is very brief, and generally it says something like a decommissioning plan will be developed and submitted to the regulator. Nowadays, more and more, there are specific ESIAs which have to be prepared for decommissioning and decommissioning programs. And they will include stakeholder consultations, evaluation of environmental social impacts, how to make the best choice to protect the environment. And this is relating a little bit to what Ping mentioned earlier. There are these different tools. There's comparative assessment, which is quite popular in some parts of the world, UK, for example. There's the use of the best available techniques, which in Scandinavia is a procedure to follow. The industry tends to use best practice environmental options, BPEOs. There is a multi-criteria decision analysis, which Ping mentioned, which is used in some sectors. So these are different processes. I'll give you an example in a minute of how to make the best decision. And then the end result is a decommissioning plan. And that will include site remediation, marking of the remains and safety zones, and then usually it finishes with a closeout or a closure report. This is an example of the best available techniques that's used often in Scandinavia. And they're all more or less the same. They have the same goal to reduce impacts. And it consists in finding an appropriate balance between environmental performance, technical applicability, and economic availability. So those issues all overlap. And from that analysis, the best available techniques will emerge to guide the decommissioning. And naturally, it depends on a number of parameters, such as the environmental requirements of the areas, the goal, technical constraints, stakeholders' expectations, economic viability, the environment itself, and the susceptibility of the environment to through different techniques. It is quite a complex process, this, determining what is the best approach, depending on the environment that you're in. So here's an example of a pipeline removal screening exercise, where an operator proposes to decommission a pipeline in situ. So following a comparative assessment, the options are required. It involves, in this case, two-stage process with an early screening to narrow the options to a manageable number that are assessed in more detail following the comparative assessment framework. So here we have safety at the top of this grid. We have safety, environment, technical, societal, and economic. So these are kind of the main parameters. And then the options are leave the pipeline, and that might have safety issues, which highlighted in red, and also environmental, but technically and economically, it's obviously very attractive. Then going down the list of options on the left-hand column, there's all sorts of removed by different methods, and they all have similar parameter grading. Mostly they're green, so they're very desirable. And there's trenching. So these are the kind of options that are considered. So this is an offshore grid. So you've taken it out of the ocean, and it's hanging on your barge, and or you brought your rig to the shore. So the structure, and now what? So principles 4 and 5 apply. What are you going to do with this hundreds of tons, in this case, of what looks mostly like steel pipe? Well, 91% of it is in fact metal that can be recycled. 81% of that's easily recyclable. But there's non-metals, and there's various electronic components. There's a small amount of hazardous waste. There's other elements, and surprisingly, but only for marine sectors, obviously there's 7% of marine growth. And then fortunately, 86%, in some cases even more than 90%, is either being reused or recycled. So it can be handled safely and economically and sustainably, but that does tend to come at a cost. After decommissioning, so then what happens? So this is another case in Nigeria, where there's a number of places where there's been oil leaks in the ground, not related to decommissioning, related to the production period. But the decommissioning and the remediation steps are vital, and they follow principle 6 in the early slide. And on land, like this slide demonstrates, land often gets contaminated and turn into brownfield sites, which need to be cleaned up at some expense. It can be done. A lot of soil needs to be removed. There's a whole suite of different methodologies for cleaning up oil contaminated sites. It has to be done carefully. It's got to be done by qualified personnel, because there can be hazardous, carcinogenic compounds that are in there that are toxic, especially susceptible as the water table, and contaminants that can reach local communities, toxic fumes. And then typical sites where these remediation elements are needed are for wells, pipelines, storage facilities, and processing plants. An example very common in America is, and other parts of the world, is petrol stations that have these submerged fuel tanks that nobody notices over years and years and years. They're leaking, and they're leaking into the ground and contaminating. And there's thousands of these contaminating the ground and the water table in some cases. So techniques have been developed on how to address these kind of issues. Just very briefly now, a few ESA examples that are out and about now. I mean, it's coming. So this is off the northeast coast of Scotland, the Murchison field, where there is a decommissioning ESA scoping report, and Northwest Hatton. So this is one by BP, decommissioning programs. So if you just look at this image, you can see what's involved there. There's tens of kilometers of pipelines, structures with concrete and steel and platforms that have to be removed from the environment. Sustainably, ecologically, health-wise, H and safety proven. Here's another one over here. This is a closeout report from Shell, the UK, for removing of the Brent Delta topside decommissioning closeout report. So these are examples, 2018, only a few years ago, of what's involved, and it's already started in some parts of the world. And over time, more and more guidelines and best practice are out there. This is another one from Scotland for decommissioning of a port. it's a port, sorry, it's an ESIA for a decommissioning port. So here you have to construct a facility that can handle all the material that you're bringing in. Now, I know that parts of India have these beaches where ships have been, run aground and then they're sort of dismantled. Well, the same kind of thing, but because it's oil and gas and there are all these contaminants, that it has to be done in a transparent, open, controlled, managed form, and it can't be done in some of the ways that India is addressing, redundant vessels. So this is a case of, and not the only one, where a decommissioning port requires an ESIA. And that's my last slide. From this, I think one of the takeaway points is that environmental and social impacts and opportunities are associated with decommissioning of marine, offshore and onshore oil and gas structures, and that determining which are how to manage the impacts and how to maximize the opportunities is the challenge of governments and advisors and around the world. So thank you very much. I think, Linda, my time's up. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matt. We really appreciate that. And I can see many questions have already started coming based on the information that you've given. And so we'll have all those at the end. But for now, I'd like to introduce our next presenter. This is Svein Arne Spillosen. He's an economist and he has been working in the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate since he has wide experience and has worked as a project director in development programs in South Sudan, in Ghana, in Myanmar, and he has even designed a one-week resource economics course on topics such as decommissioning. So on the Norwegian continental shelf, he's worked as an analyst of oil-producing fields, actually almost 90 of those, and he's worked with exploration economics, exploitation of seabeds, and decommissioning. So he has quite a great wealth of experience, and he's going to take us through the final presentation on further on decommissioning. Welcome, Sven.
Thank you. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it, and we can see you quite as well. Thanks, and we can hear you well.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Excited to be here, and thank you, Ping and Matt, for very interesting presentations. The thing about decommissioning is that there's always something new to learn. It's an industry that's developing. We have some experience with it, but still a lot to learn. Now, the NPD, the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate, we're the regulator for the Norwegian continental shelf. So for all oil and gas activity, and our main objective is to maximize value for the Norwegian society from this industry, considering health, safety, and environmental concerns. In addition to oil and gas, we also regulate the Norwegian continental shelf when it comes to carbon capture and storage, and also seabed minerals. But today it's about decommissioning. And on the Norwegian continental shelf, we have 495 installations. And in addition, several kilometers of pipelines, several land facilities, and some 1,000 wells. And at the end, they will need to be decommissioned. Most of our installations are subsea installations, but also some huge concrete installations. One of the biggest concrete constructions in the world is on the Norwegian continental shelf, the Troll platform, and also several, more than 60 fixed steel installations, and also about 20 floating steel installations. Now, we have mainly had our focus on developing and production of oil and gas, but now also we're getting closer and closer to the point where we have to remove all these installations, plug all the wells, and make things back to how they were before we started this activity. And then there are some important considerations that we as authorities have to make. And first thing is the optimal timing of cease of production. When should we stop production? And there's not always do we have the same view as the companies. When we decommission or after cease of production, we have also to consider whether or not to decommission the whole installation, or can it be reused somewhere else or for other industries as well. And of course, in all the things we do, we have to consider the environmental protection for the industry, or for that the impact the industry makes. Now we have a very long coastline and a lot of ocean and a lot of users of the ocean with fishery, tourism, now also a lot of wind farms. So we have to consider how will this affect other users of the sea. And then, as in all other aspects, we have to consider cost efficiency. We need to use the amount that we need to use, but also we need to use it efficient. This is quite relevant for a lot of countries, especially countries where you have decided to start a decommissioning fund, because then you start the fund way before you actually start decommissioning, and then you have to make some assessments on when to start the fund, how big should it be, and all these considerations. Now, all our licenses need to hand in a decommissioning plan. And it's divided into two main parts. The first part is the disposal part, where there needs to be a technical description of how it should be disposed, detailed also. And then also a financial aspect, how much will this cost, and the different elements, how much will they cost. And one important consideration that must be made is what are the different alternatives that exist when it comes to decommissioning, because there will always be different ways of doing it. So the operator and the license need to describe these different alternatives. And one alternative should always be to continue production, not to decommission at this time. So then they have to argue why they should stop production at this time. The second part of the decommissioning plan is the impact assessment. So what are the expected consequences for the environment and other users of the sea? And both the proposed impact assessment and the final report must be submitted for a public consultation. So we do have a public hearing on all these documents, and both the proposed report and also the final report, so that we keep it open and transparent, which hearing institutions have been heard in the process. Now, we have a set of rules that we need to follow when we do this. And first of all, we have some national laws and regulations. We have the petroleum law, and also regulations underlying the petroleum law that has descriptions on decommissioning. In addition, also the HSE regulation and the Environmental Protection Act. All these must be followed. And we don't have very detailed petroleum agreements. Most of our industry has been regulated in these documents. And in addition to this, we also have some international agreements. There are some international obligations that Norway has undertaken by signing and ratified some of these international agreements, the United Nations Convention on Law of the High Seas, the OSPAR Convention, and others as well. And so it's also important that depending on which part of the world your country is, which convention and which international agreements exist and have they been ratified by the country. And that will describe some obligations that you need to undertake when starting decommissioning. Now, Ping and Matt have said something about the phases of decommissioning. I think it's also good to be aware that it has different cost elements connected to them. And I put a red circle around what's the biggest part of the cost, and that's the well decommissioning. That's the plugging of the wells. Also see that the project management part has quite a high share of the total expenses, and also the post-CSO production running. And in that, there's maintenance. After production, if there's no maintenance, especially offshore facilities will start to deteriorate quite quickly. And if it's not maintained, it will increase costs at a later stage. And then there are facilities that must be removed, must be taken to shore, recycled, hazardous waste must be handled with care. And there is a limit to the access to heavy lifting vessels required to remove the substructure and the topsides. And also there's a limit to access to waste handling. That also must be considered into this. So, what are the important considerations that must be made from a regulatory perspective? Well, as I mentioned, when is the optimal CSO production? We tend to see that not all the different fiscal regimes around the country gives the companies incentives to investments at a later stage. So maybe decommissioning will start too early. The liability, who's liable, who's responsible for not only the decommissioning and the removal of the structures, but also whatever happens in the area around and its effects on the environment. Which regulations, laws, and international conventions apply to that specific project? And what we see when we work in different countries around the world is that very often there will be a petroleum law or maybe a regulation on different aspects of the development and the production phase. And then the decommissioning phase will be started later, after the signing of petroleum agreements, after production has started. And then there will be a lot of questions that has not been considered at an early stage. So that's why it's important also to, at a very, very early stage, to start to look into the international conventions, the national laws, the national regulations, and whether or not they consider decommissioning. And when the decommissioning is conducted, it's normally by an operator or a license needs to be monitored, that they actually do follow the rules that are set for the project. And one challenge there is that the effect decommissioning and this industry has on different aspects, both the environmental and the economics, technological, will involve different governmental institutions. So cooperation between these institutions will be necessary, and that can at times be challenging, but environmental agencies must be involved, HSE agencies, the resource management agencies, financial management, all these must be involved because it has a big impact on all these different aspects. And also, I would like to mention that what seems to be the main focus on the petroleum, oil and gas industry is the profit. And the profit comes from the production phase. You need to have the development phase to start the production phase. And that has normally a super profit, a very high profit, and it has a lot of attention. The decommissioning stage is only costs. So to find a way where it has the same focus as the production phase is challenging. Now, we would recommend that to start the planning of the decommissioning at the development stage. In Norway, we have it as part of the PDO. Not a detailed planning, but it must say something about the decommissioning. And what's interesting is that could affect the actual development of the installation. That the older developed installations were not developed to be decommissioned, increasing costs of decommissioning. So developing a field or an installation that has been developed also to be decommissioned could save quite a lot of costs and also make it easier from a technical aspect to remove the installation. We have normally a detailed planning of the decommissioning phase, we say 5 to 2 years before shutdown or before cease of production. And so it depends on how big the installation is, how complex is it. So some very small developments might not need more than a 2-year planning, but the other big ones might need 5, maybe even more years of planning. And also to have a close dialogue with the international oil companies or the national oil company also to actually have a good understanding of what's required from the decommissioning phase. And then this last point is secure the financing. Now, in Norway, we do it over our tax system. I know that a lot of countries use decommissioning fund, and there are some challenges with both ways of doing it. One way I've seen in a lot of countries is that there's a specified timing for when you start the decommissioning fund, and it can be referred to timing or how much of the field has been produced. The challenge of that is that when you start producing a field, you never quite know how long it will produce. So you could end up in a situation where you start the decommissioning fund way too soon or way too early, and that has a financial impact also on government take. Also, how will such a fund be managed? What kind of risk profile would such a fund take? Where do you invest that money? And what do you do if the fund is not big enough, or what do you do if it's too big? And what kind of effects does it have on your fiscal system? So these are things that need to be discussed and often involves different governmental institutions and also a close dialogue with the companies that you have signed an agreement with. So thank you very much for your attention. That was all I had today.
Thank you very much, Svein, for your presentation. And thank you so much, Ping and Matt, also for your presentations. We have quite a good number of questions arising from the presentations that we've had. So I think we'll go right ahead and take the questions. And so I'd like to address questions not necessarily in the way they were asked, but I would just pick a presenter and then give you a chance to answer a question that's been directed to you specifically, and the other presenters can chip in. So we'll start with Ping. So there's a practice to present a chapter on decommissioning in development ESIS. Is this even relevant at that point, since at the time of decommissioning, the environment and social economic baseline could have changed significantly? What is your take?
This is thank you, Linda. This is a good question. Actually, I thought Sven might have an answer to that as well. So this is, if I decipher it correctly, is to ask about, whether decommissioning should be considered already in development plan. I think certainly so, and that is actually a good practice to consider already, how you would decommission the structure and consider what is the impact of that early on. So there can be an initial impact already in the development stage. And then when you come closer to the actual decommission process, most countries would require a more detailed ESIA. So that's the common practice that I know of in most of the mature decommissioning, mature region with decommissioning regulations. If you contrast this with how things were done in the 70s and 80s, where when you build the structures, there were really little or very limited consideration on how you would decommission it. So today we found we are faced with some of the challenges to actually decommission these structures that were put in the 70s. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and maybe just to pick up to pick up on that with Spain, seeing that this has to be done and it's going to take a bit of time. You said in Norway that it should be 2 to 5 years before decommissioning. Is that the general practice across Europe, or is that just the practice in Norway, Spain?
That is the practice in Norway, but I think it's quite common as well in Europe. And if I can just pick up on what Ping said as well, that to put the decommissioning also in the PDO, it's also important to know that in the decision-making project, whether or not to develop a field, decommissioning and the cost of decommissioning will not have a big impact, due to the way we do the calculations, and all costs have been discounted, so it doesn't have a lot of value. But I think it's really important also to put it in the development plan as well, to kind of keep focus on it at the very early stage, and also maybe then you could get developments that have been developed to be decommissioned that would save some costs and make it maybe also technically easier to remove an installation, maybe 20, 30 years down the line. And Linda, you've been
much for that. Yeah, I'm back. So so there's a question then, that would it not be more environmentally friendly to maintain some facilities on site due to the impact of removal? And there's an example like pipelines in unstable soils, or such kind of things. Are there instances that you know or that are documented where it's more feasible or environmentally friendly to leave those installations on site or in the ground or under the sea, as it were? Sven?
Yeah, I guess Matt. Oh, okay, Sven,
yeah. Well, one was some of the parts of the installations that can be left behind is pipelines, if they're cleaned and they're covered, so it doesn't affect with fisheries at a later stage. So some parts of the decommissioning, it will be better to leave some of it behind. But then again, if it's not cleaned, you could have leakage of chemicals. So there needs to be some kind of monitoring also, that it's actually cleaned up before anything is left behind.
Yeah, can I add to that, Linda? So indeed, there are instances where it's actually removing the pipeline could have a significant negative social and environmental impact. Sorry, removing the pipeline in this case. So so again, you look at all you use tools like multi-criteria decision analysis, comparative assessment, the number of tools that are available to kind of compare overall, considering all the different criteria that can affect the community, environment, and so on, future users of the land, what should be the right solution. So, it's not a decision that is, it's a decision that needs to be involving various stakeholders. And when you land on the decision, then you need to look at, is it safe to be in that, to leave the pipeline there in perpetuity? So there may be cases that you need to stabilize the pipelines and so on. So there are a lot of things that needs to be carefully considered and approved by the regulators. And as Matt already mentioned in his presentation, there needs to be an impact assessment, environmental impact assessment on during decommissioning and after decommissioning. So decommissioning in this case could be a decision to leave the pipeline in situ, but to make sure that it's safe to do so. So including cleaning and ensuring that any remaining residue does not poses potential harm to human health and the ecology of the environment. So I'm not sure if Matt wants to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, thanks Sven, and thanks Ping. I can't add really more actually. As you say, there's pros and cons of leaving and removing, but as Sven emphasized, you can't leave something that has a risk of contaminating further. So there are techniques for cleaning pipes. You can send this thing called a pig, it goes up and down it, you can cleanse it and that. So if you're 100% sure that the pipe is really clean and there is no risk of contamination to the environment, water table, local communities, then there may be a case for doing it. At the same time, a pipe is metal, and if you can recycle it, it may be more positive economically and for local communities to recycle that, thousands of tons of metal pipework. Each one has to be treated on a case-by-case analysis.
Thank you, Matt. So then, sorry.
No, I think we've both we've comprehensively covered this one now, I think.
Yes. So there's a question here: does the operator bear all the costs, or is there an opportunity or a system where these costs can be, shared with other parties?
I'll start with that briefly. It's not my strength, but I know that in some parts of the world it would be all on the operator, and that would be kind of best practice if the operator is still there. But there are situations where you get things called orphan wells and things which are left behind by companies that are long gone or who have been bought by others, and the responsibility hasn't been carried forward, or they've been defunct. So there are situations where the government and local communities have to bear the cost. Maybe Ping has examples.
Yeah, I think who pays for decommissioning, right? Often, of course, the owners, the existing owners should pay for the majority of the cost, or should pay for most of the cost. But in some countries, like in the UK, New Zealand, there are tax relief systems for decommissioning activities. So you can, go online and search what this means. But it really means that the asset owner can deduct decommissioning costs from their taxable profits and potentially claims back some of the taxes they have previously paid. And then there are countries like Malaysia, for example, that have petroleum sharing contracts that after an agreed number of years of operating, the assets is returned from the offshore, from the operator to the government to continue operating. And then in that instances, government could become potentially, depending on what is stated in the petroleum license agreement, the government as the owner in its late life could become fully responsible for decommissioning. And yet in other countries, their government, other countries like Brunei, the government are in joint ventures with oil companies and then would pay them its share of the decommission cost. So I would say the answers really varies from country to country, depending on the license agreement, depending on the structures that was put in place. And I'm sure Sven can share about what's the experience in Norway as well.
Yeah, in Norway, it's tax deductible. That's why we take 80% of the profits, but then you get to deduct the decommissioning on the afterwards. So kind of the state takes on a big part of the risk here. I'd like also to mention that one issue when it comes to financing and costs is that, you know, there are incidences where a well has been plugged and several years later it will start to leak. Then who is responsible for those costs? And has that been thought through when a country decides on the financial aspects of decommissioning? That if a company that left a country 5 to 10 years ago and a well starts leaking, most likely the country itself will have the problems with the leakage, and most likely the country itself also must take on the costs of fixing the problem, unless there are some agreements that the company have to cover those costs as well, or if there is a fund that will kind of be a security mechanism for these potential incidences.
Yeah,
Thank you.
agree with that.
Yeah.
We've seen, I think I've shared in my presentation some examples of orphaned assets, and you know how countries are waking up on how this should be managed. So I think firstly we need to also ensure that the sales of assets are sold to companies that are capable of managing the decommission cost later, that understand the decommission cost of these assets, so as to prevent, you know, so it's very important to always keep your eye on the cost of decommissioning at every stages, you know, throughout the sales, during, you know, as we already said, even at the start of development and so on, and you understand this as you go closer to actual decommissioning.
So then, how about cases where there is probably the national legal framework is not strong enough on this matter of decommissioning? Are there any international legal frameworks or best practices to ensure proper and sustainable decommissioning? Especially, you can see like maybe new countries, I would say probably countries in Africa, and we've seen example of Nigeria, where these things the decommissioning has not been done well. Is there an international, you know, legal mechanism or framework that can step in to look at such issues? Sven? And then
in my experience is that we've seen a lot of countries where the decommissioning phase has not been regulated, and so the development of the laws and regulation that comes to decommissioning starts during a development phase or a production phase after the signing of all petroleum agreements and other documents. So in my view, that would be a bit late, but it's not necessarily too late, because also what we often see in these documents is that the decommissioning phase is quite wide. It's not very detailed described, which could be an opportunity, but it could also be dangerous if it's not agreed with the operators how specifically how this should be done. And also, I must say that it doesn't help anyone with a legal framework if it's not implemented. A legal framework will never do anything good if it's not been implemented. And to do that, it's really necessary to build competence throughout the governmental institutions to monitor all the phases of this industry, and especially maybe now at the decommissioning phase, because we've seen several examples of installations sitting out in the ocean or on land for years and even decades, rusting and chemicals leaking, and it's really dangerous to start decommissioning those installations. So it has a huge environmental impact.
Ping, you want to add on that?
No, I completely agree with Sven. I think you know, the national regulations are really needed to manage decommissioning locally. There can be international guidelines, but you know, it's the national legislation that needs to be matured to manage the decommissioning activities from not just the decommissioning activities, the development activities up to decommissioning.
Okay, thank you very much. So Matt, you'll be able to switch on your camera so that we can see you. Are you with us still? I'm just about to throw a question. So in your opinion, what is the best or most comprehensive best practice document on decommissioning? And could we be able to direct the listeners to such a document?
Well, there are a number of documents, and the ones I've come across, I mean, it's difficult to say which is the best. I mean, we can provide certainly a list. There are some from California, there's quite a number from the UK, there's some from other parts of Europe. There's this one from Nigeria, it's quite recent. So I wouldn't say that there was the best. I think some of them are more applicable to certain parts of the world where that particular type of decommissioning is taking place. So there may be 4 or 5 that I would consider to be the key documents, and we can certainly list them or even share the soft copies later.
Yeah, I'll start by, Linda, you're on mute. I'll take an opportunity to advertise the international, the IOGP document, which actually is a document that summarizes all the regulations globally. It's free to download in the International Association of Oil and Gas Producer webpage. So I encourage that everyone go there, and there are a few number of other documents that provide best practice guidelines, for example. But I would also recommend like sites like on OGUK as well. There are quite a number of guidelines. Yeah, so these are, for example, some of the websites you could go to. There's on reuse and repurpose, I shared that Next Step from the Netherlands also have some good report on decommissioning. So it, as Matt said, it depends on exactly what type of guidance are you looking for.
Okay, thank you. I think everyone has had that, and thereafter, I think because we'll share the presentations, we'll have a chance for people to see the information that they're asking about. So there's a question here. Has it, are SWOT analysis conducted in decommissioning, in preparing a decommissioning plan whereby the strengths and weaknesses can be used as recommendations for future establishments of oil and gas facilities? Have you seen that a SWOT analysis conducted? Sven?
Well, there are all sorts of different analysis conducted to the different when we come to the stage of the decommissioning plan, both on the technical side, and we also always ask for several alternatives, so that the operators must always try to see it from different perspectives and different views, so that they can describe different alternatives, and also they have to argue for why they choose one of them, why they think that's the best alternative. That also gives us a lot of insights in what could be done. So if there are any considerations that we have to make as a governmental institution that maybe the operators haven't thought about, that could make it easier for us. So always different alternatives and different ways of doing it, including continue production.
Okay, thanks. So a question for all 3 of you. Have you seen instances where a facility, oil and gas facility, has been repurposed for another use so that there is no need for decommissioning? In your experience, have you seen that? Say for it, switching it to renewable energy type of installation? Matt?
I haven't physically seen with my own eyes. I've only seen suggestions, really, where platforms, for example, in the North Sea, that are in suitably windy places, could be used by a wind farm. But the problem there is that the platforms for oil and gas exploration are not necessarily in the right place for a wind farm. So you might save some cost by not having to make a structure on the seabed, but if you were 5 miles down the road, you might be in a better position to generate more wind. So plus you've still got to decommission the well, and there may be pipelines and other structures associated with the platform. So it sounds romantic and very convenient, where you can just take a platform and stick a wind farm on it, or stick a giant whatever, fairground attraction. Or I mean, there was one platform in the North Sea that used to be a radio station many years ago. There was this illegal radio station on a platform in between Ireland and England and Netherlands. Platform. Anyway, I can't remember what the name of the radio station was. That was in the 80s. But no, I didn't know of any examples. Maybe Ping and Sven can share that.
Yeah, I want to point again back to the report by Next Step on reuse. I think if you look into the report, it has some good information discussing the challenges of using transferring the assets from oil and gas to renewables. For example, the timeline of when you decommission and when you need when you plan to install these facilities for wind, for example. So all these are challenges that need to be overcome by the industry, both industry. So you might, as Matt already rightly said, right, it might not be in the exact location. So then you will probably need to remove it to shore anyway. So you would need to decommission from the current site. You might refurbish it and then put it offshore. But then when you have to do all that, then how does that compare economically against building a new offshore wind structure? And then, I also hear now the trend for offshore wind industry is to have floating structure, not fixed structures. And all these are factors that need to be considered. But you will find that, I mean, as steel increase in value, for example, it may indeed become economical to refurbish and this old steel structures for wind structures.
Sven, have you seen any now that you've seen so many installations?
I've seen some plans and some suggestions on, for instance, changing one of the floating installations into a smaller wind farm. But as Matt said, it's the fixed ones, they're very rigid. So, but the floating ones, that could be a possibility. But then again, we're back to costs. To change one installations into doing something completely different, and especially these installations that have been sitting out there for decades, it's not necessarily cost efficiency. So, but also some suggestions of using some of the floating devices to in connection to fish farming in the sea as well. But I've never seen it being done. I've just heard some of it's a suggestion only at this stage.
I can add one more. Sorry, Ping, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna react to Sven's comment on fish farm. The challenges with transferring these offshore structures to other industries is that there's still a need to maintain and decommission the structure. So how many other industry can afford this decommission cost? Again, relate to the transfer of asset sale. You must make sure that the new owners can afford the maintenance and decommissioning of these structures. All right, back to you, Matt. Over to you.
Yeah, I'll just we're all thinking offshore structures, but I know I've been involved in a pipeline project on Tanzania for the last 4 years, and it's a rather long pipeline. I don't want to mention the name, but it's out there. There was some talk about when that pipeline, the oil that it's going to transport, if it goes ahead, is no longer used, would it then be decommissioned? And some of the suggestions that have come up is that the wayleave, which is a space of land, that narrow corridor, 500 meters wide perhaps, that goes along for hundreds, in this case over 1,000 kilometers, could be used for other infrastructure. So it's not so much the case of removing, in this case, it's not removing the nuts and bolts, the pipes and the materials, but using the space that was allocated to the pipeline, using that for other purposes. And it could be for other pipelines of gas, for example. It could even be for transportation. But because once you've got that wayleave and you've done EAA and there's been compensation and all the other hundreds of issues associated with a wayleave that traverses a country, once you've got that space legally assigned to a pipeline, I mean, it's a narrow corridor, but it's very long and it's uninterrupted, and that you can use that for other things. Okay, so that's just different from an offshore platform which is very specific, to actually hundreds, in this case, over 1,000 kilometers of bush and farmland that have a space along it. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. I can see we still have a few more questions, but I'm really seeing that we are pressed on time. So I'd like to invite each one of you to give us a key takeaway message that you think we shouldn't walk out of this session today without having that in mind. And we'll start with you, Ping.
Yeah, thank you, Linda and Sven and Matt. I think it's been really interesting, and I learned a lot as well from Matt and Sven's presentation. Yeah, I just want to leave this one key message. I believe that any decommissioning policies and regulation that we developed should not be prescriptive. We've spoken about all the opportunities and challenges, but I believe that policies and regulation need to be flexible enough and risk-based so that we can tackle the challenges and maximize the opportunities that there are in decommissioning. And there's also the importance that we spoke about of early planning, open stakeholder engagement, and to support for all parties to support the development of evidence-based decommissioning science and technologies.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Ping. Sven?
Yeah, I would just say that start the planning early, very early. It's better to start it a bit too early than a bit too late, and also to define as clear as possible the roles of the different governmental institutions in this phase, and also the roles of the government versus the companies, and have that very clear, and be transparent about it. And also to have a legal framework developed and implemented.
Thank you very much, Sven, for that. Start early, key message. Yes, yeah. And Matt?
Start early.
Okay, well, it's difficult to build on these now, but I've just come up with one that hopefully will add. So I think it's really important to consider the best available techniques, tools, expertise that is available when you are considering a decommissioning plan. And bear in mind that the decommissioning, as we mentioned by our colleagues, is a fairly new industry, and it's evolving fast. It's really picking up. I mean, we didn't show a curve. There are curves of the amount of material that's getting decommissioned more and more. So that the expertise is growing. There are experts that do it now. There are more guidelines. So keep up to date with that and get the best advice and use the best techniques before you start looking at the costs. Look at the best of everything to do it properly.
We can't hear you,
okay,
Linda.
So Matt, your internet was a bit shaky, but your key point was that there's lots of available. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, so yeah, I think I was saying that I probably didn't hear much well, but I heard the fact that the best available technology, there's a lot of information out there, go out and get it and take advantage of all these new things that are coming up. So this has been so interesting. It's a pity we don't have much time, but maybe I'd encourage our panelists to go into the chat box and try and answer some of those questions before we leave or as we get ready to leave, so that we don't leave anybody out. So thank you very much for your presentations. They've been insightful, they've been exciting and interesting. So back to you, Chi. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Linda. Thank you, Sven. Thank you, Pink. Thank you, Matt, for this very interesting discussion that we had on decommissioning. I think I'm almost an expert on decommissioning, hearing three of you speak about this. So as we close, just to remind the attendees that you would receive a link. So you receive an email using the email you registered. So you have a link. Would like to hear your feedback. Like we would like to hear what you thought about the webinar. Would like to hear what you can propose for us to do to improve our further webinars. So please click on the link when you receive the email, and also to remind you that it's a prerequisite to get your certificate of participation, and you receive your certificates 1 week after you have completed the survey, between now and 1 week after you complete the survey. So thank you so much for staying till the end, and we look forward to having you next year for the next series of webinar. So thank you to our panelists again, and to Linda, very able moderator. Wishing you guys a lovely weekend, a lovely week ahead, and I hope you enjoyed and learned something from the webinar. And one last thing, it's recorded, so you also get the link to the recording. And I hope you've downloaded the presentations, which you can find on the handout section in the platform. So all the presentations you've seen today are available for you to download. So before we close, we'll give you like 3 minutes to download all the presentations, and then we'll log off. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Linda, again.
Thank you, Linda.
Have a nice
Thank you, Chi.
day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Linda. Thank you, Chidima. Bye.
Bye.